Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. What the heck happened to Ryzen 9000 series CPUs? Why did they fail? Can AMD fix them? And are the prices going to get cut? What about the 9800X3D versus the 7800X3D? Are we going to see an actual significant uplift on that thing, or is it going to be another 5%? We'll also talk about GPU upgrades right now and AM4 X3D CPUs. More of them coming? If you get value out of this video, please give it a like. This makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. With that, let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by VIP SCD Key. Say goodbye to crazy expensive Windows licenses and that terrible Activate Windows watermark. Right now, use the links in the video description, head over to VIP SCD Key and get a Windows 10 or 11 OEM license for a great price. Pick your product license, then use the PC Builder discount code PC25 for an additional 25% off. Go to the activation settings on your PC, put in the code, and boom! Windows is fully licensed for a crazy low price. And Windows 10 can be upgraded for free to Windows 11. And they have Microsoft Office licenses too. Use the links in the video description. All right, before we jump into Ryzen 9800X3D versus 7800X3D and where I think that's gonna end up, let's first talk about the underlying assumptions for all that with Zen 5. What the heck happened with Ryzen 9000 series CPUs? Two great questions, both by Pindle and by Chico, kind of the same. I'm going to combine them into one mega question here. Pindle writes in basically, how do we reconcile what AMD is trying to accomplish with the 9000 series over the 7000 series? Looks like these parts weren't designed with generational uplift in mind. Can they fix this in the BIOS? Chico adds in, what about RAM compatibility and other things? And how is that going to affect pricing? AMD made a couple of huge mistakes in its launch, but I'm not even interested in those as much because those are more optics based. I want to talk about performance. Yeah, they should have led with a 9950X. There's all that kind of stuff that maybe they should have given a slightly higher TDP, blah, blah, blah. I don't think any of that is anything other than kind of marketing. Let's talk about the actual performance, because you can turn on Precision Boost Overdrive in these CPUs. And yes, I know they're going to release a new BIOS, for instance, as the time I'm filming this, that's going to up the TDP, but we can turn on Precision Boost Overdrive. So what's the point? What is the point? Is it really going to up the performance that much? You can manually overclock these CPUs too. I just don't see how that's going to claw back maybe more than 1% or 2% in terms of performance. And if you look at where Ryzen 7000 versus 5000, you saw like 20+% uplift. It was massive. It was a massive uplift in gaming. We just don't see that with Ryzen 9000. So can they fix this in terms of microcode, BIOS, RAM? I don't think they're going to be able to do anything on the RAM side. While the memory controller runs natively faster, slightly faster than the Ryzen 7000 series one did, I'm hearing that there's no actual upgrades to the RAM controller other than it might be just kind of, they've figured out how to make these things better, so they're able to bend them a little bit better, so they're able to hit those frequencies a lot better. And that's why it's going to run at 5600 natively as opposed to 5200 like the previous generation. That being said, in terms of the way that RAM works with the Ryzen CPUs, and they've got the memory controller on the CPU, you've got the RAM speed, and then you have the Infinity Fabric. There's kind of this triangle, right? And there's a golden ratio in there. I'm not going to get deeply into it. Others have done a lot of good work on this. But basically, you would like the memory controller to run at 1:1 with the RAM speed, and then have the Infinity Fabric run as fast as it can, essentially at 2000 megahertz. You're not going to be able to really adjust that much more. It's the possibility of 8000 speed memory being better. But right now, 6000 is the sweet spot because of how that complicated three-body problem works, right? 8000 speed memory might help a little bit, but it's stupid expensive. And I think you need your head examined if you're going to go out and shell out 2 to 3 times as much for RAM just to make your CPU run a little faster. Why wouldn't you get a 7800X3D and problem solved? Problem solved, okay? You could just do that instead. It just doesn't make any sense. You're basically trying to artificially pump up a CPU that just can't really perform, and you're trying to kind of cover that over by spending a stupid amount on your RAM instead of investing in your GPU or just getting a better CPU, right? There's no reason to try and inflate that up. So I don't think RAM's gonna help. In terms of the BIOS, look, I've seen some in terms of the higher core count CPUs, the dual CCD CPUs like the 9900X, 9950X, people reporting that there is a huge amount of latency kind of core CCD to CCD there. And there's some weird stuff going on. And it's possible that AMD might improve those parts to the point where they are able to run kind of very large multi-threaded workloads. I've also seen some reports that Windows might be spreading some of these tasks across CCDs when it really shouldn't be doing that. We did get some correspondence from AMD in terms of turning on like the game bar and stuff that you would normally do with the X3D 7900X and 7950X, the X3D parts, in order to be on the right CCD and get all the tasks in one place so that they can utilize the Vcache. I wasn't really sure, and I haven't dug any more into that. So there's some possible things out there, but I feel like this is mostly a fishing expedition where maybe they'll claw back a couple percent. But typically when a new product comes out, there's tuning that goes on anyway. There's always tuning that goes on. You'll find that Ryzen 7000 series CPUs get more performance today than they did at launch, and they're better tuned. Look at the DDR5 RAM compatibility. A little bit of a mess at launch, especially with the B series motherboards out there, and AMD fixed that with an AGESA, and I can't even remember when it was because at this point, it just feels natural to plug in whatever RAM into that and have it work. Quick note, by the way, I know a lot of reviewers saying they were having issues with RAM compatibility with like the 9600X. In our build, for whatever it's worth, again, we didn't do testing, we did a build guide, but we didn't have any RAM compatibility issues. I used actually a number of different kits, but I will note we didn't use the reviewer BIOS. The reviewer BIOS is only available on basically the top board from each AIB. So only 4 boards, and those are super expensive. These are not boards you would ever use with a Ryzen 5 gaming build. So we instead used the B650 Tomahawk, and we used the beta BIOS that MSI had on their website for just publicly available. We didn't use the privately available reviewer BIOS, and we didn't have any RAM compatibility issues. So it's possible some of that is just BIOS differences that will get ironed out and we won't see the RAM compatibility on there. But all this to say, I don't really think that AMD is going to be able to claw back significant amounts of performance in any kind of BIOS updates. Although my crystal ball works just as effectively as everybody else's, which is half the time it's right, half the time it's wrong, maybe even it's wrong more than it's right. You can flip a coin on these things. There's really no way to tell the future. All I can tell you is what you have right now. And what we have right now are CPUs that certainly are not worth the price that AMD is charging for them. And honestly, somewhat regressive. It almost feels like 11th gen Intel all over again. Of course, that leads us to what about the Ryzen 9800X3D versus the 7800X3D in terms of price and performance? And when are we even going to get that CPU? That was on a lot of your minds. Jay Brinks, Lurch, callsign Jubilee basically asked what's my thoughts on the 7800X3D versus 9800X3D for a new build. Should you be waiting for that CPU? This person's coming from an i9-9900K. Other people wondering if AMD is going to learn from their Ryzen 9000 mistakes and kind of fix that, or are we going to see a similar uplift? In other words, only about 5%. Well, first let's talk about what our expected performance between the 9800X3D and the 7800X3D, and then we'll talk about availability and price. But let's start off, where do we think, based on what we just saw for Ryzen 9000, I think it could be safe to assume that you're going to get about a 5% uplift. However, AMD did say in a couple months ago that they were working on other ways to improve the performance of their top X3D chip, the 9800X3D, other than just slapping X3D onto the existing Ryzen 9000 series CPUs. They're working on ways to basically be able to get more thermal headroom in order to clock up the CPU higher under load and do some other things with it. So let's assume that they're able to maybe put together some of these things. It's hard to say where the performance is going to come out. And I base this kind of on 13th gen Intel in a lot of ways. When Intel made their performance claims 13th gen over 12th gen, I was very skeptical. Go back and look at my videos. I didn't say that they couldn't do it. I said I was just super skeptical because it sounded like all they were doing is kind of a little sprinkle of this, a little sprinkle of that, a little sprinkle of this, a little sprinkle of that, and somehow we were going to get magically like 20% better gaming performance. And I was like, I don't think that that's the way that's going to work. However, to Intel's credit at the time, although lull because the CPUs are having issues right now, and maybe those things are related, maybe they're not, is that Intel was able to push that performance. And I was shocked. I was shocked at how good the i5 13600K was, at the 13700K, 13900K. Obviously, I was also a little shocked at the power usage for like the 13900K. And I said, that's kind of a worthless CPU. I think the 13600K was a great CPU. And we recommended it, and then Ryzen cut their prices, and Intel never followed suit, and the rest is history. So what do I think in terms of like AMD basically like a sprinkle of this and a sprinkle of this on 9800X3D? I don't want to say that they can't significantly improve performance of the 7800X3D. I'm just very skeptical given where we just went with Ryzen 9000, unless they're actually is something wrong with Ryzen 9000 and they're able to fix it between now and the launch. Let's talk about the launch, for instance. When do we expect to get the 9800X3D at all? A lot of people were saying we weren't going to get it until CES in 2025. That's early 2025. Possible launch kind of maybe a couple months after the announcement in January. And that makes some sense because you'd think that AMD would want to sell through like the 9700X, 9900X, some of those other CPUs that probably won't sell that well once the 9800X3D and other X3D variants come out, including maybe they'll do a 9900X3D and a 9950X3D and have both CCDs have the V cache on them, so you don't have that kind of that core switching issue that we had with the Ryzen 7000 series high core count X3D CPUs. Once those come out, I think they knew that their sales of the other stuff will go away. Also, they were probably planning to introduce like a 9700 non-X, a 9600 non-X, like non-X versions of those existing CPUs that they could sell for a discounted price. The problem is, if you have your product completely fall on its face, I think everything then gets called into question. So I will say it's kind of odd that we have the 800 series motherboards just randomly coming in September. So that also kind of leans me to think might get the 9800X3D sooner rather than later. Although hopefully AMD has learned its lesson. If that thing is not ready, don't launch it yet. Don't launch the CPU until it's ready. So where does that leave us on pricing, especially with the 9800X3D, the price of the 7800X3D, where's that gonna go? And are we gonna see price cuts on like the Ryzen 9000 series CPUs and on X3D ones, as well as 7000 series CPUs? Well, just like I told you, AMD removed all the price discounts off Ryzen 7000 just before the launch of the 9000 series. So even though on Prime Day, the 7600 was like $171, and I told you to buy it, you weren't going to get that kind of value again. I noticed that even though it floated back up to 200 during the Ryzen 9000 launch, it quickly floated back down to $180-ish, where it's sitting right now. And I expect to probably keep floating down because AMD in Ryzen 7000 series, those MSRPs only lasted for 7 weeks. Then they cut them massively after 7 weeks. They do not want to publicly admit that they made a massive mistake with the pricing of Ryzen 9000, the way they didn't admit it with the pricing of Ryzen 7000. They're just going to cut the price. And this is AMD's history. They basically want to come in as high as they can because they know that they can always cut the price, but they can't raise it later. So they'd rather come in too high and then cut the price later, even though I think this hurts their overall sales. I think this hurts their brand. Some accountant they have thinks that they're being smart over there by doing this, they're just getting somehow a better deal from consumers. And in fact, I would argue they probably not, but this is their history. So I think they're gonna see Ryzen 9000 series price cuts in a month or two, probably closer to 2 months, so they don't have to admit that they made a mistake. There'll be huge price cuts on those CPUs. They may become good value at that time. We'll evaluate them when they do that. In the meantime, the 7800X3D floated all the way about to $400. It's now down to $365. And I expect when the 9800X3D, they're gonna do the same thing. It'll float right back to $400. So unless you're somebody who's willing to spend all the money for the best gaming PC on the planet, you're gonna buy like a 5090 when it comes out. And I know there's some of you folks out there, because I see your comments all the time. You don't care how much it costs, you're just gonna spend the best, then you should wait. But everybody else, I think that 7800X3D looks super attractive right now. I would snap one of those things up. I think the 7600 looks super attractive. I would snap one of those things up because I suspect they're gonna overprice the 9800X3D based on the popularity of the 7800X3D. And the fact is it'll be the top thing on the chart. And NVIDIA does this with the RTX 4090, by the way, their 90 series GPU. So it's not like AMD just invented this. They're just basically copying what NVIDIA already does with these things. So yeah, I expect that 9800X3D will have a super price premium on because it will be the fastest gaming CPU on the planet when it comes out. We'll see about Intel and we'll maybe talk about them later, but that's where I expect things to go. So kind of plan accordingly. All right, of course, AM4 isn't dead yet. And we got some great questions about potential amazing gaming CPUs on AM4. Elidas asks, is the 5700X3D the king budget AM4 CPU? And KR98 asks a great question. What are my thoughts on the Ryzen 5500X3D? What is the 5500X3D, you ask? Well, it turns out in trademark filings, somebody discovered, and this was not in the US, this is another country, the name 5500X3D was filed. And what happens is a lot of these companies, they go out and they file just trademarks for all these different names. Some of those products are never coming out, but they're just filing it in case they decide to launch them they are like legally able to defend that name and not let anybody else use it, basically, in terms of selling that product. And this is what I think the 5500X3D is. Video Cards and others carried articles on this, but it's entirely possible that AMD does what AMD does so well, which is they basically take silicon that would otherwise be trash and they'd have to just chuck in the trash, and they come up with a new part name on it. That's where the 5600X3D came from. Basically, that's a CPU where it wasn't going to be a 5800X3D in terms of validating all 8 cores on the CCD, so they disabled 2 of the cores, and you get the 5600X3D that was a Micro Center only launch. Funny, by the way, that the timing on this, because just the other day I had a friend asking for their friend who was just heading out to a Micro Center, hey Jason, here's their build, what should they be upgrading for like $600? I said, hey, why don't you look at grabbing either a 5700X3D or a 5600X3D that was Micro Center only. Then when I got online to look at that Micro Center, I couldn't find the 5600X3D. It's out of stock. I couldn't find it almost at any Micro Center out there. It seems like those are all gone. However, 5500X3D was likely a slightly lower clock. If they were able to release a 5500X3D somewhere around $130 out there like the 5600 is currently, I don't know that they even would necessarily do that. I know they want to sell to CPUs, but then where's the Ryzen 7600 in there? 7500F, all those kind of more budget AM5 CPUs out there. What place in the market do they have if suddenly you can get cheap B550 motherboards that are like $100 or $89 for board, way cheaper DDR4 RAM, and the speed doesn't even necessarily matter that much because these are X3D CPUs. It just calls into question whether or not they'd actually do it. If they do it, it will be amazing. And I will say, I think there's a reason that the 5700X3D sunk down to $183, but then they quickly pumped that thing back up to $210 during the launch of Ryzen 9000 because they do see it as a competitor, I think, to like the 9600X, even the 7600. So unfortunately, Intel really hasn't created enough competition. AMD's main competition right now has been with itself. Hopefully Intel can change that with their upcoming Arrow Lake CPUs. But yeah, right now I think there is a lot of life left on AM4. All right, we got Archivist who asked, what's the ideal upgrade path for the RTX 3080 10GB? If they're going to wait for the RTX 5000 series, should they get one of those GPUs? Or should they buy what they believe is going to be a discounted 4080 or 7900 XTX? I just want to highlight this question here. First of all, RIP 3080 10GB. Those things are completely obsolete right now. If you want to play any kind of AAA title, 1440p, and you want to crank up the settings all the way, which is typically what you do with an 80 series card, right? I think a lot of people have buyer's remorse who got a 3080 10GB instead of the 6800 XT, because that 6800 XT would still be cranking just fine. And you're like, oh, ray tracing and all that. You can't really ray trace with 10 gigs of VRAM, as we're finding out, not in 2024 at least. So unfortunately, that's just something to keep in mind. And I will just say, I like that you're going for either the 4080 or the 7900 XTX, both of which have plenty of VRAM. 16 gigs, I think is going to be fine even when the next generation consoles come out. I believe they're going to have 16. They might have a little bit more though. So if I were you, I would first of all not wait. If you feel like the 3080 is not cutting the mustard for you right now, just go out and get something right now. Don't wait. I think we've gone a little bit bonkers in terms of the buy now or wait. I think it was a direct product of the craziness that happened during the GPU shortages, during the cryptocurrency fueled GPU shortages, when those GPU buying decisions were like, am I going to spend $2,000 today? Am I going to spend $1,000 on an RTX 3060 and buy it off eBay from a scalper? Yeah. That seemed like a much bigger decision. Now that GPU pricing has returned to normal, I know folks are going to sit in front of a wall of graphics cards and electronics products and tell you have to wait in order to save 20 or 30 bucks. Like, just get what you want. This is a hobby. If you can't afford your rent because of the price of the GPU, don't buy the GPU, right? Obviously make smart buying decisions. Don't sacrifice survival. Just go ahead and get the GPU you want when you want it. I wouldn't wait for like the RTX 5000. It's also just not clear what kind of volume we're going to get for that, what kind of pricing NVIDIA is going to put on those. I mean, NVIDIA's focus right now is like 1000% AI. It's certainly not on their gaming GPUs. And if you look at their gaming GPU revenue, it's relatively flat year over year. Even it's down a little bit. So you want to just buy a graphics card to play games and have fun. If the 3080 is not cutting it, go out and buy the GPU when you need it. The only time I think this ever really applies in terms of wait is when a product is either right about to be announced or has been announced. Then I think it's okay to wait a month. but don't wait half a freaking year or more just to possibly save 50 bucks on a graphics card. Get what you need now. Speaking of GPUs, Sean Plays asks, is the Ryzen 4070 good? Now, I have to admit, when I first heard Ryzen 4070, we get tons of comments and we try to answer all of them if we can. And I started to see, like a couple weeks ago, the Ryzen 4070. I'm like, and immediately I think, oh, well, they meant the RTX 4070, not the Ryzen 4070. That's clearly just a mistake. But then it kept happening and it kept happening. And I'm like, what is going on? What is this Ryzen 4070? So I finally just Googled it. And yes, it turns out it's kind of a meme. Somebody on Zach's Tech Turf, they basically wrote into Zach and said, hey, what about the Ryzen 4070? And I guess they had some fun with it and it became like a meme thing. If you see Ryzen 4070 everywhere, it's just basically a joke. I just wanted like a PSA out there because I was certainly confused. Remember, if you got value out of this video, please give it a like. This makes a huge difference to the channel, and subscribe for more cool PC content. Speaking of cool content, did you check out our August CPU market update? We go through all the current CPU prices right now, what their performances and what their price of performances, which ones you should be buying, and I even said what the price should be for the Ryzen 9600X and 9700X. Check it out right here, and we'll catch you on the next one.